Welcome
everyone.
to season 4, episode 11.
We appear to have some sound feedback there.
Thank you for letting me know. Let's have a look and see what
That's
we
it,
can do
fixed.
about
It's all
that.
fixed. Good.
It's
Away
fine.
we go.
Well,
Sorry to
thank
interrupt
you.
your great intro.
Take two.
Well,
Take two.
welcome to season
We can
4,
edit that.
episode
Fix it in post.
11.
You're so professional.
So professional. Inside the Rookery. We are joined tonight by James Swallow, award-winning and sorry, he distracted me with a wave. This is going
Sorry.
so well. How rude of you to wave it to me when you've come on our show.
Okay, quietly.
Yeah. Welcome to the show, James. We're really happy to have you with us. Yeah, I've been confused tonight. Seago is right. I've been confused because tonight we have 2 Jameses rather than 2 Andys, and that has thrown everything out of kilter. So yes, welcome to James, New York Times bestselling author and the Times bestselling author. I'm here today to talk about writing games fiction. James, would you like to give yourself a little introduction?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be here, and it's also good to be here with my old friend James. Twice the Jameses, twice the awesome. That's what we're going to bring tonight. What can I say about myself? I always like to describe myself as a writer of stuff. As you said, I'm a New York Times, Sunday Times bestselling author, BAFTA-nominated screenwriter. I've worked in television, film, video games, tie-in fiction, and original fiction. I write pretty much anything I can get my hands on. If it's not moving, I'll grab it and write on it. I love my job. I love to be a writer, and I'm also a long-time gamer as well. Both of those careers are kind of inextricably linked, and they've brought me to where I am now. And I'm really looking forward tonight to talking about games writing and games in general.
Fantastic.
So
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, no, Lindsay, I defer to you in all things.
Thank you. I was just going to say we've got loads of questions pre-submitted by our Discord community and Patreons as always. But I think we've got a few questions for James first, and I'm going to let James Wallace go first.
Yeah, I was just going to dive in. You said you're a professional professional writer, but you said your first professional sale was to a games magazine. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, come with me now, won't you, into the dim and distant times of the past, into the what probably would have been the early 1990s. I got my start writing fanzines, anime fanzines, sci-fi fanzines, gaming fanzines, that sort of thing. But my first ever professional credit, the first ever thing I ever did that I had a contract and I got paid for, was I wrote a Star Trek role-playing game scenario for Challenge magazine, which, if you remember that publication, that was Games Designers Workshop, GDW's in-house magazine. And the very first thing I did was writing for them. So it's kind of cool that I like the fact that my first piece of paid work was for gaming and for Star Trek, two of my greatest loves as a fanboy. Funny story though, just as I wrote that, like 2 issues later, the magazine folded up. So I never actually got paid. Well, I got paid in games because the company broke up and they said, well, we don't have any money. We can't afford to pay you for the article, but we have a shelf full of games. Would you like some free games instead? And as a dyed-in-the-wool gamer, I was like, yes, absolutely. That's terrific. Thank you. Please pay me in gaming. So I think I got some great stuff from Traveller, some couple of great Traveller box sets. So that was my first experience as a professional writer. But I've been a gamer for years, and I've been a role-playing gamer. I started off back in the 1980s. My kind of gamer DNA, the first role-playing game I ever owned a copy of and run was TSR Star Frontiers. And off the back of that, I just kind of got myself deeper and deeper into the gaming hobby. And for years, I was running games and GMing stuff, and that I think that skill, that ability to tell stories, and that ability you get to kind of generate narrative in an existing world, that has done very well for me because I've been able to parlay that skill into actually a writing career selling books.
We've had a lot of people on the stream, as you might expect, who their first interaction with gaming was some form of role-playing. We are a role-playing stream. And most of them cite their first interaction, the first game they owned, to be a fantasy RPG, but yours was a sci-fi one. Were you drawn to sci-fi already, and that's why you started there? Or is that what drew you to sci-fi?
No, I've never really been like a fantasy guy. It's just I've always been into science fiction. I mean, I coveted the original black box edition of Traveller, when I was a kid. And that was originally going to be the role-playing game that I bought, but I couldn't afford it. But I could afford the TSR role-playing game, so I bought that one instead. So I've always been sort of pure blood science fiction. I mean, I've written a few little fantasy things here and there, but science fiction is kind of where my heart is.
Cool. And you mentioned Star Trek earlier on. I believe you are still the only British person who has worked on the Star Trek TV series.
As a writer, yeah.
As a writer, yeah.
I think
obviously, there's a chap called Picard, I think.
Yes,
but
indeed, that guy, yeah.
Tell us more.
Well, that was that's kind of my equivalent of the I won the lottery story, really. Way back when I was writing for magazines, I used to do sort of sci-fi journalism, and one of the publications I worked for was the official Star Trek magazine. And a lot of the writers who worked on that magazine were fans as well. And so we would often get the opportunity to interview people who were on the shows. And if you're a fan, it's like, wow, isn't that great? I get to have a one-on-one conversation with these actors in a show that I really love. But because I was a wannabe writer, I was always the one who kept saying, can I have a conversation with the writers? Can I talk to the producers and the directors and the people who make the show? Because for me, that was as fascinating as talking to the actors in front of the camera. And very sneakily, I was kind of getting a bit of an education as well. So I would interview these guys and I would say, like, that's interesting. Tell me about the show. And what would you do if you had a problem in Act 3 with this character? And I just would sneak in writerly sort of questions about how to write script and what have you. And essentially, because I asked the right kind of questions, they said, well, would you like to try and pitch for the show? And they basically kind of held the door open and looked the other way while I snuck in and pitched a few episodes of what was Star Trek Voyager at the time. And I think over the course of maybe 4 years, I pitched something like 200 or 300 story ideas. You have to come up with these very quick, very small sort of back of a fag packet kind of synopses ideas. And then if they like them, you have to develop them into something that's a little bit more robust. Out of those 4 years, I made 2 sales, which gives you an idea of how difficult it is to even kind of get on the dartboard in terms of how many shows they're producing, because TV in America is it's a machine that eats ideas. It constantly needs sort of more and more and more. And back in those days when you were producing seasons of kind of like 22 episodes, they had it was a hungry machine that kept on needing to be fed story ideas. And so I was kind of a combination of asking the right questions and being in the right place at the right time. I sold these 2 different story pitches, and that was kind of my first big sale as a writer. I think that's the thing that's going to be etched on my tombstone. He wrote for Star Trek, right underneath my name. But I'm very pleased to have been able to do it, because Star Trek was like kind of my first fandom of the TV shows and things that I enjoyed. And I'm really pleased that I've been able to kind of give back a little bit to a franchise that gave me a lot of enjoyment.
James is trying to speak.
You're on mute, James.
I'm sorry, the dog is eating his dinner just there. I know the magic of television. And he's a noisy eater. I apologize. So yeah, there was a question from Seagoat. So you provided them plot hooks, and if they liked them, you made an adventure from them. But I don't believe you actually wrote the scripts for those. You provided essentially the hook. They then developed them. Yeah,
that's right. It's at the time I was a nobody, right? I had no agent. I was just literally sort of coming in off the street and saying like, I've got this great idea. Would you like to buy it, please? And so as soon as they did, they wrote a check for me and said, here you go. Now we're going to give this to someone who's actually a proper writer, and which was fair, which was absolutely fair, as well. And the great thing about it is these other writers came in and did some fantastic jobs, and they made me look great, because I can turn around and go, I helped make that happen. But that's part of the way that television works. It is a very collaborative medium. It is all about working in a sort of collegiate format with a lot of different people. So for me, it was a really exciting experience to just be a small part of that.
So exactly how much did you submit for that? Was it just the small synopsis originally, or did you develop out to a few pages?
Well, the first idea I did, I think I wrote like a kind of 1-page outline for it. But the second one, I mean, after I'd sold the first one, obviously that was a fantastic experience for me, getting that phone call. I can remember that having the telephone was, in fact, actually there's a gaming connection to this. On Friday nights, I used to role play with my friends. I used to GM for them. And on a Friday night, the telephone in our house was in the kitchen, in the room next door to the living room where we role played. So the phone rings like kind of 11 o'clock on a Friday night. I'm like, who the hell is calling me at 11 o'clock on a Friday night in the middle of the game? We've already had quite a bit to drink, so I'm a bit loose, as it were, you know. And I pick up the phone. I'm like, who the hell is this? And the voice on the other end says, please hold for, a Brannon Braga from Paramount Pictures. And I sobered up very quickly. Very quickly. And a couple of my friends came in and they're like, where's the beer? And I just handed the beer and went, do not come back in this room, and locked the kitchen door. And they were like, oh, well, we'd like to buy your story pitch. And I can remember just being numbed by the whole sort of thing. It's like, oh my God, is this really actually happening? And then, and they must have thought I was really, really cool and calm and collected and very super professional. But I was just kind of, yeah, okay, just absolutely stunned by the whole thing. And it was only after it was done, I went back into the room and the guys were like, what happened? And I was like, I think I've just sold a story to Star Trek. And they were like, let's drink some more. And then it became a great show. And but once that was done, as exciting, as fantastic as that was, my first thought was, I have to do this again, because if I only ever do it once, I'm a one-hit wonder. I'm a tourist. It's just like, oh, you just got lucky. And I thought, I have to prove I wasn't just lucky. I have to prove I did this because I was good. And so, if anything, I dedicated myself to working even harder to trying to make a second sale. And that one, I can remember, I traveled all the way out to Los Angeles. I was in the office. I pitched all of these story ideas, and they shot down every single one of them, one after another. And as I'm getting to the end of my list of ideas, I thought, this whole journey, the amount of money it's cost me to fly out here and do all of this, it's been a complete waste. And I'm going to go home with nothing. And, as that dark cloud kind of came over me and I was getting ready to packing up my stuff to leave, and I was pitching to a guy called Brian Fuller, who is now like a series producer on a lot of really great shows out in the US. And he must have seen the look on my face, and he said, have you got anything else? Anything at all? And in the taxi on the way to the studio, I'd had an idea which I'd just jotted down on the back of a note card. And I said, well, there's this one thing. And I pitched it to him, and he went, that's great, we'll buy that. Oh, so that's how close. That's how it's a great Hollywood story, right? And that's how close I came. And I was like, you sure? He's like, no, it's really good. And then I went back to the UK. A couple of days later, they called me and went, yeah, we're doing that one, and that was that. I did try to pitch a few stories for Star Trek Enterprise as well, which came afterwards, but that was a much more difficult show to kind of work into. And then the rules changed after that. When the new Star Trek shows came down, those had a more closed writing room. So getting the opportunity to pitch there, unfortunately, wasn't on the cards for me. But in the time that passed after that, having that as kind of a calling card, being able to go to other writing people, other editors, and say, well, I worked on Star Trek, that opened a lot of doors for me.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And to zip forward, I mean, a lot of what you do, you are working in other people's universes, but the stuff you're doing, or you've been doing most recently, is you've been writing Tom Clancy novels, how does that work? Do you balance your laptop on a Ouija board, or what? How do you? It's kind of bizarre to me to be essentially writing under another writer's brand. I mean, another brand, sure, I've done that. Andy, everyone's done that. Everyone, obviously, everyone has.
Everybody's done that.
But how do you write Tom Clancy?
Well, it's the thing about in fact, I'm actually writing a brand under a brand, because I'm writing for the Splinter Cell franchise, which is its own kind of IP underneath the umbrella of the Tom Clancy's brand. Tom Clancy was famously somebody who saw the kind of value of games as a medium for telling stories. He was quite ahead of his time, really. He was a gamer anyway, right? I mean, the story is that, when he was writing The Hunt for Red October and Red Storm Rising, him and Larry Bond, another techno thriller writer, they gamed a lot of it out playing Harpoon to see if if all of the rules could work out. And if you buy Harpoon now, that scenario is in the rule book. But so he was a gamer, right? And he knew that video games and and tabletop games had a value, an entertainment value. So when Red Storm Entertainment was the game company that he set up to kind of exploit his name to develop games, and the Clancy game IP, kind of I suppose the the pillar of that IP is something that's kind of near future techno thriller with a sort of strong element of realism to it. And there's a whole bunch of different games underneath that. There's you know, The Division, Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell. Am I missing any of them? I don't know. Anyway, but so there's all these different franchises underneath that, and the expectation is that there's a certain style, a certain techno thriller kind of vibe that you get. So writing the Splinter Cell novels that I did, I had to be true to that game's particular franchise and characters, like you do when you're working on any sort of tie-in. But in terms of kind of channeling Clancy, for me, what I did is I went back to look at his fiction and just the way he writes. You know, they're kind of very sort of muscular prose, very much kind of, you know, all that brand name flash, all the technology and the hardware, all of that kind of foregrounding all of that. So it's kind of it's a stylistic thing, really, just to kind of make it feel Clancy-esque, I guess.
Brilliant. Very cool. And they've been, I mean, you had one of your Tom Clancy books was serialized on Radio 4.
Yeah,
which,
that was a very
it's
unusual
the media
thing.
machine eating itself, isn't it? It's
just, it just kind of came out of nowhere, because we did an audio book of it, and then Ubisoft, who are the current owners now of the Red Storm franchise and all the Tom Clancy stuff, they said, well, we want to broaden out into different arenas, and we're talking to the BBC about doing a radio drama. And I love audio drama as well. It's one of my favorite things to write. And I was like, wait, what? Really? That's a crazy idea. It's unfortunate for me that because my schedule was so tight at that time of the year, I couldn't write it myself, and it was passed on to other writers who took it on and did the adaptation. But it's really kind of wild to see something like that turning up on BBC Radio 4 on a Friday afternoon. You know, Tom Clancy, gunfire and stuff blowing up, and I'm kind of thinking, well, you know, anything that broadens the genre, I'm happy about that.
Yes, usually Radio 4 drama is about a middle-aged middle-aged housewife, not a half-life. That's something else entirely. Who's a bit dissatisfied with things and is looking over the back fence at the handsome gardener opposite. Somehow Splinter Cell doesn't seem to be the regular kind of stuff that they'd go for.
I think that probably tells you a lot about an aging demographic in gaming, graduating to Radio 4. Sorry,
I think you're right. Yes, I think also aging demographic in Radio 4 producers as well, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there was an intention on their part, that because Radio 4 just want to do something a bit different, and they want to try and. I think they were looking for something that kind of bridges the gap between a gamer fan base, a younger fan base, and also kind of the older fan base. So you have the Tom Clancy name. That's going to immediately pull in a kind of dads and lads type audience, because that name carries cachet, you know. And then also gamers will go, oh, Splinter Cell, you know, I know that franchise, I know what that's about. And I think they were trying to pull in an audience from both sides of the Venn diagram. I don't actually know how well it's done. They haven't told me what the audience demographics are, but I'd absolutely love to see more of it. I think it came together really well in the kind of construction of it.
I do think this is a tangent, but I do think radio is having its day again, as people have moved to podcasts. And, you know, I talk to loads of people. That's what they listen to on their commute, if they have one. That's what they listen to chill out. They don't necessarily, if it's video, they sometimes just listen to it with audio anyway. And so I think radio has a real opportunity to get back into that space and provide really like high quality production that they were famous for forever, but back into a space for a modern audience.
I could not agree more. I think I always said it's a fantastic medium for storytelling, especially for science fiction, fantasy, and horror, because you have the best special effects budget in the world.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the pre-submitted questions. So I'll go to Seagoats, and then Oxecutor's got one actually live in the chat, but we'll start with this one. Seagoat asks, when writing for a game setting or franchise, how much freedom do you actually have to write your story?
That's a great question. And it's one of those kind of how long is a piece of string questions. It all depends on what the franchise is, what the IP holders are like. Some of them have ironclad grips on every tiny little detail, and God forbid that you deviate even the slightest bit, you will be punished. Whereas other ones will be like, oh, go crazy, you know, do what you like. So sometimes, to give you an example, some of the Star Trek books that I've written, sometimes I've had Simon & Schuster come to me, the publishers, say, we would like a Star Trek book set in this particular timeline with this particular character doing something like this. Off you go. Other times they've said to me, what do you want to write? Pick one, anything, any part of the universe, anywhere, anytime, anyhow, pick a story and write it. Other times it's somewhere between the two. It's like, just write a story about this crew on board this starship, but whatever you want to do. So it is very variable. It's all down to the whims of the particular person holding onto the strings that control that particular intellectual property.
An Oxecutor has asked, is there much difference between writing gaming fiction and just writing for an IP? So how would you classify the difference? What do you think?
Well, the thing about when you're writing gaming fiction as opposed to like an IP, like a movie or a TV show, gaming fiction, the great thing about games is most of them tend to have a whole load of backstory already done for you. And this is the thing I love about being a role-playing gamer, is that one of our secret weapons as a role-playing gamer / writer is gaming source books. There are not many places you can go to find out exactly how much the cost of one horse would be at a certain time period, how long it would take to get from this city to that city. You don't often find books that tell you stuff like that, but that stuff is packed into role-playing games because you need it as a GM. You need to know how many gold pieces that particular thing is going to cost. And so you can use that as a writer, like to give sort of verisimilitude to your world. So if someone says to me, write a story in the setting of Traveller, I know that there's a load of supplements I can go and pick anyone off a shelf and go, okay, I'm going to write on this planet, and here's all the backstory about that. And I only have to concentrate on creating the story that I can slot into that existing world. Whereas if it's like a movie, you might watch the movie and see sort of certain characters in certain places, but the rest of the world isn't filled in. And so you have to fill all that stuff in. So you have more work to do. And, sometimes there are different challenges. If a lot of the world has already been filled in, the difficulty is, how do I come up with something new that hasn't been done and render it in an entertaining way? On the other hand, if none of the world has been filled in, how do you create something that dovetails with the existing world and doesn't upset the people who own the IP and go, oh no, you can't talk about the fish people. We're going to do that in the sequel movie. You have to talk about the mole people instead. And you might find yourself with an issue like that.
I'll just add a little bit that this speaks a lot to hard and soft world building, which has become somewhat of a term of late in writing and role-playing game circles. I was speaking about it in another stream just yesterday over in World Anvil, actually, where the hard world building, where all the scaffolding is very much in place, and you don't need to just go off and figure it out for yourself, or softer world building where the stories are developed as needed without much pre-planning already in place. So you're going to probably find this popping up in multiple streams as you move around the internet just now, because it's become somewhat of a term of the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been watching the Peripheral, the William Gibson. I talk about this a bit too much. Love the novel, enjoyed the TV series, but Gibson's style of world building is very much, he'll allude to something, and then 40 pages later will allude to it from a different direction. And it's very much on you to build up the mental picture. It's very rare that he info dumps on you, whereas the TV series, because it's dealing with visuals from almost the first frame, you know what it looks like. That picture is not in your head, it's on the screen. Very, very different. And that completely changed the approach, I think, of the whole drama, because you're not there you're working out some of it, but in the book you are working out a lot of it. You are constantly adjusting your mental image of what this world is. And yeah, I think it's really, really different approach to storytelling. And it does really affect how you approach things when there is an existing canon of stuff and you are charged with creating essentially new canon works, or works that are going to fit within that canon, that fans will refer to in future.
And you also need as well to consider there'll be an expectation from your audience as well. Is depending on what the material is, depending on what kind of IP it is. Some fans will be like, oh, it's this kind of storyline, it doesn't need to have layers and layers and layers of detail. They're happy with that softer storytelling. Whereas other fans from other kinds of franchises, they will want all the really crunchy, granular detail. And if you don't provide that, they'll feel unsatisfied with the finished product.
It's also sometimes a big difference between fantasy and science fiction, where with science fiction, there's almost an expectation of that, particularly for harder science fiction, that expectation of detail to explain how it all actually works. Where often on the more fantasy side, you'll get somebody coming along going, and the magical wizardy woo, Doctor Who's himself out of this particular situation with a quick flick of his wrist, and a far softer approach in general. But yeah, given that you're largely science fiction, I imagine that those extra details are sometimes going to be more prevalent than, for example, those who might be working more on the fantasy side more heavily.
But I love doing that sort of attention to detail stuff. I mean, I think even in fantasy, certainly that I think that all the fantasy that I've read that I've enjoyed has had that kind of degree of rigor to it. It doesn't just say, "Oh, a wizard did it." You know, there still feels like a
sonic screwdriver.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there is, the sci-fi equivalent of that is like it's nanotech. How many times you've seen that get away with it? You know, they get away with the same idea,
or a piece of Star Trek jargon.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Totally. And you know, and you get the techno babble generator and like reverse the polarity of the neutron flow.
Oh, of course.
So before, I've got a more controversial question coming up. Before that, let's just talk about like the nuts and bolts. So Kilishandra has asked, what's your writing schedule? Disciplined with set times to write, a set number of words per day, or are you less rigid? And I suppose I would also add, like, what would be your tips for writers who are starting out?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll start with the last bit there first. Your last question there is the one piece of advice that I give to anybody who wants to be a writer, any kind of newbies. 2 words, finish it. Because so often I talk to new writers and they say like, oh, I had a really great idea for a story and I kind of got halfway through it and it didn't really work for me. So I left it. And then I half did another story and I half did another story. And I always say, like, you know, no one wants a plumber to half plumb their sink. No one wants a cook to half cook their meal. No one wants a writer to half write a story. Even if you write something and you get to the end of it and you think, well, that's not that great. That's a good thing because you develop the critical tools to analyze your own work, you know, and the only way you level up is literally you have to land the story, finish it, earn that XP, and you get to be a better writer. But that's my general advice to pretty much anybody who wants to be a writer. But to go back to the main question, my writing schedule, I tend to do pretty much a sort of 9 to 5 day. So I come from a journalistic background. I have that kind of journalistic sort of mindset. So I don't sit here waiting for my muse to strike, staring out of the window, kind of like, you know, looking into the middle distances. I sit down, I punch a clock, I start writing. So by 10 o'clock, I've done my emails. I'm sitting there, I'm typing away, and I work through 5 days a week through till about 4 or 5, sometimes 7 o'clock, depending on how much work I've got to do. But I just write. And I usually set myself a word count target based on the length of the project, based on what kind of project it is. And I just do my best to hit that target every day. And if I can get a little bit over, that's great. If I get under, I penalize myself and like kind of like, you know, you're terrible, work harder. And then and the next day I'll just slave drive myself into it. But essentially it's set hours, set a target, sit in the chair, arse in chair, hands on keyboard, and get to it.
I think it's worth adding that most of the professional writers we've spoken to on the stream have largely said something similar. Not all, but most. For example, when we had Graham McNeil on, he was very much, it's a job, do your job. And viewing it as that, I think, is a very important part of it. For all I am very much a less rigid chap, I still work 9 to 5, but I do because I wear so many hats. I go from job to job to job to job throughout the course of the day.
9 to 5. It's just maybe not UK 9 to 5.
No,
just to be clear.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think I watched that interview that Graham did, and I think he gave some fantastic advice there on that. It is important to, you know, especially if you want to do it as a career, you need to treat it like a job. I mean, if you're somebody who writes for fun, you can be a bit more loose with it. You know, if you're not, if you don't have an editor breathing down your neck, if you don't have a deadline, then yeah, by all means, you know, take a little longer over it. But if you want to do this for a living, you have to develop a professional attitude and you have to approach it in that fashion. You have to write your books, deliver on time every time, and your publisher will love you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with the hit your deadlines angle more, because I've managed so many projects with so many creatives, and it's interesting to see how each of them deal with it, particularly in the roleplay industry, where many of the people are Well, they're doing it as a side job, something that's sitting on the edge. So for them, it's not a 9 till 5 thing; it's a 5 till 10 thing, or something
hustle.
similar. So very much finding yourself people who can always hit deadlines is gold. Finding them is gold dust. So you build a very strong reputation from doing that. So yeah, do your job.
And what it comes right down to is you can't write a good story in your head. You have to put it down on paper. You can't fix it. You can't make it better until you've actually written it down, because half of writing is rewriting. In your head, it's always going to be perfect, but it's this nebulous, non-existent thing. But once you get it down the page, then the real work begins. And I think that's where, for me, that's the exciting part of being a writer.
Yeah.
Same with games. Exactly. I give exactly the same advice to my games design students. It's perfect in your head. The moment you start making it real, you see all the problems. And that's when most people give up. Don't be one of those people.
Yeah, exactly.
So Georgios in the chat, I can't read Roman numerals in a rush, so someone can work that out. 1990, I don't know, 2 maybe. Hey James, big fan. Flight of Eisenstein was the book that got me hooked at Horus Heresy. Waiting to receive Garrow, Knight of Grey. Friends told me it's phenomenal. And then the follow-up. What are we to expect after the Siege of Terra is over? Is there any talk about the Great Scouring and future projects for Warhammer that you can talk about?
Okay. Well, I'm not heavily involved with a lot of that stuff right now, but I can tell you that all of those things have been talked about. Certainly the Great Scouring period and some of the other sort of like the Age of Apostasy, all of the really cool sort of bits of Warhammer lore that haven't been written about in detail. I can tell you that all of those have been discussed in one way or another. Whether they go forward and they produce a series like they've done with the Heresy, your guess is as good as mine. But I think, there's a lot of great stuff there in the lore. If they don't want to mine that IP, I think they'd be missing a really great opportunity.
It is 1992. Yes. Full victory for me. So going on to the more controversial one, although I didn't mean to, this in no way is this some kind of subtle dig that I have chained this onto a question when someone has asked about Games Workshop. I always planned to ask this question next. But just to be sure, I'm going to ask a different one. So which games, Seago asks, or franchise did you relish working for the most, and which did you like the least?
Okay. Well, again, I'll do the second part of that first. I wouldn't work on something I didn't like, because life's too short. I think there might have been points early on in my career where I had to kind of take jobs because I had to take it because I had bills to pay. But I've always felt that if I'm going to work in somebody else's universe, it has to be one that I enjoy, or at the very least, I can find something in it that I enjoy. Because the people who do enjoy that universe, they're going to tell straight away if you don't like it, if you're phoning it in. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to deliver a piece of work that the people you're aiming it at aren't going to like. So you have to work on stuff, certainly in terms of IP and franchise, that you care about, that you're invested in, because it will show. So I would, if someone came to me, I'm trying to think of an example of like something I'm not a huge fan of. And actually, I don't really want to say it out loud because I'm sure I'll piss off whatever fans there are of that franchise. But, if someone came to me and said to me, do you want to write this? And I'm like, I don't like that show. I don't like those movies. I would just say, you know what? Find somebody who's going to give it the love it deserves, because I'm not your guy.
Say it.
Harry Potter. But there you go. All right. I once got asked to work on a Harry Potter video game, and I was like, no, because I've never really been a fan of, in any way, shape, or form, of those books. And I just said, like, no, you know what? Just no. I'm not the right guy for you. So, give them to somebody else. In terms of ones I relish for writing, well, I mean, all of them, because again, it's the opposite of that is when someone says, hey, do you want to work on this cool thing that you really like? It's like, yes, I do. It's like, why would you, every single one of those opportunities, someone saying to me, do you want to write a Star Trek story? Do you want to write in the Warhammer universe? You want to write Tom Clancy? Do you want to do Doctor Who? All of these are things that growing up have given me so much enjoyment, things that I've really enjoyed being a participatory reader and fan of. And then the opportunity to kind of say, well, do you want to add a little bit of your own to that kind of giant, crazy quilt of stories? God, why would I not say yes? You know, and I've absolutely relished all of those things in different ways. Some of the jobs have been harder than others. Sometimes it's turned out to be a real pig to work on, and other stuff has been sort of smooth as glass. But that's just the, you know, that's just the nature of the business. But I try to find that kind of enjoyment and that thrill for every IP that I work on.
When we were working on Wifrit 4, because we had played in that world for so long, so Andy had GM'd it for, you know, decades, it felt like at that time in the Warhammer world, obviously not in different editions of the game. When we were writing things for it, it genuinely didn't feel like making stuff up. It felt like writing memories and writing things down. And, you know, Lindsay, can you write something about this career? And I'd be like, I would just think of all the people I had known over the years in the world who had done that career. So I was writing about people rather than, and I think that's the beauty of writing for things that you're passionate about, you've been a fan of, you've lived. It's not often that fandom necessarily pays the bills, but when it does, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is pretty good. I mean, there are times when I've worked on projects that I never thought I would have the opportunity to. There was for a few years back, I worked on a Guardians of the Galaxy video game, which unfortunately never came to fruition. But on the day we had like the first meeting in the studio, and I went into the office and they had this big pile of Guardians of the Galaxy comic books, all the graphic novels all piled up. And they said, okay, well, we want this type of story. And then just completely off the cuff, I said, right, we want these characters, we want this. And I was dredging up all this stuff from years of reading Marvel comics without looking at Wikipedia, without reading these things. And they were like, how are you doing all of this?
Because I love it.
And suddenly I said, you know, here we go. It's like 40 years of reading Marvel comics. Today's the day. All pays off. It was a lot of fun. It's a great shame that we never got to put the game out, but there you go.
That's it. Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, just a footnote to that. You know, another project essentially that came out of the mind of somebody who spent so much time working in franchise fiction. Dan Abnett created or co-created the graphic novel that became the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and he's credited in the movie credits. Best known for his work on Warhammer and Warhammer 40k novels. You know, it's so once again, you know, it's. There are people who kind of hold up their noses about franchise fiction and writing tie-ins and stuff like that. But there is some amazing creativity going on in that, and amazing originality, and some really, really brilliant ideas, and some brilliant people as well.
It's true. I mean, sorry, did you go ahead?
I was just going to say we haven't had Dan Abnett on the stream. If he'd like to come on, he'd be very welcome.
I'll drop him a line.
Dan's a great raconteur as well. He's got brilliant stories, you know. But to James, to go back to your point there, yeah, I mean, I've encountered that a lot. That kind of snobbery is that sort of the idea that writing for an IP is this sort of like, you know, intellectual wasteland. It's bereft of creativity, and you know, it's like, oh, but don't they just do all the hard work for you? You know, but it's not painting by numbers, and that's kind of the way I think some people see it. If anything, you know, it's you know, you're working inside a box, and so immediately you're going to push at the edges of that and say, well, where can I tell an interesting story? But now I've got this limited environment to tell a story in. How is that different from someone saying, well, write a one-act play with, like, you know, 2 changes of costume? Now do that, and it becomes a spur for your creativity. To how do you tell a story in that world? How do you unfold that existing narrative and IP and characters in an interesting and compelling way, and still stay within the lines? And I think that's a very difficult challenge. You know, a fellow writer, tie-in writer friend of mine, Keith DeCandido, once said to me, he summed it up really well. He said, why is it that you get an Oscar for adapting a novel into a screenplay, but if you adapt a screenplay into a novel, people think you're a hack? And I think that sums up to me the way that a lot of people think of tie-in and IP writing. Yeah,
that's a really good line.
Yeah, and just moving on from your idea of being in a box, Infinite Saxon has asked, have you had any run-ins with the right holders about what you'd like to include? Obviously, that you may speak about. We would not like yourself to get into any legal trouble.
I mean, there's always a to and fro. Like I said earlier, you know, sometimes some IP holders will be like, yeah, go crazy, do whatever you like, whereas other ones will be, you know, quite controlling about what they want, and often I've pitched ideas where I say, I'd really like to do this thing. I'd like to use this particular character in a certain way. And they've said no. And sometimes the best IP holders are the ones who come back and say, look, we don't want you to do this because we're going to exploit that character in a different way somewhere else. The worst ones I've worked for just say no, and they don't tell you why. And it's really difficult to work with that, because you're asking, well, okay, well, what did I do wrong? Well, we're not going to tell you what you did wrong because it's a secret. It's just, well, okay, can I do this? No, you can't do that. To give you an idea, I worked on the Disney Infinity game, which is the little Toys to Life video game, and I worked on some Star Wars stuff for that. And at the time, they were developing the plot for The Force Awakens, and I was putting together a plot line for the game. And I said, well, in this game, there's a robot, and he has a secret map of the universe that we're going to use as a MacGuffin in the story. And they were like, you can't do that. You can't have a robot. You can't have a map. And why? And it's because the reason is they were going to, that's a plot point in The Force Awakens. But they wouldn't tell me why. And so I was like, well, can you just give me a clue about is it the robot you don't like, or is it the map? He's like, no, none of it. And so it was so I had no idea what I was doing wrong. And it was only after the film came out, I was like, oh, I see. That's why you didn't want me to do it. But because they were so super protective of the IP, they wouldn't even give even a little. So that kind of working in that kind of relationship is difficult. Whereas I was working on a tie novel for Star Trek Discovery about one of the main characters, Saru. And we'd originally developed a whole idea for the novel that was going to be a whole backstory for him. It was going to be like an origin story in the book about where he came from, all kind of revealing like his species and their home world. And we put a lot of work into it. And then the producers on the show went, actually, this is a really cool idea. We want to do it on the TV show because it's just too good to put it in a book. I was like, oh, thank you. Okay. So can you do something else? So I had to put that story aside and write a different story about that character. But what was nice is that when they finally got around to showing it on the screen, they kind of used a few of the ideas that I'd created for that outline. So some of it still appears in the sort of like the tapestry of the story. So that gives you an idea of like, the extremes that these things can go to.
Let me just. So here's an interesting question. I feel like there's some history here. So John Golding asks, what's your opinion on scalpers and limited editions? Fans miss out because scalpers buy all the small print runs, then sell them at extortionate prices. Can you see a way to fix this?
And I know exactly what this is about, because just recently I've written Night of Grey, which is a story for the Warhammer 40,000 for the Horus Heresy franchise. And that was released in a limited edition. And of course, these limited editions, they sell out very quickly, and immediately people are flipping them on eBay, which I think is just terrible. I mean, I think if I was in charge, I would limit the number that people could buy just to make it fairer. And I think just make more of them. I mean, it doesn't have to be super limited, make it kind of slightly less limited.
Yeah, it's a very hard problem to solve. There are always going to be people who are buying it to resell it. And, short of putting an entry exam on the order form, how well do you understand this franchise? What is the motivation of the character in book 3? It's really hard to tell who's going to be buying it because they love it and who's going to be buying it because they see an opportunity. If concert tickets can't work out a way to make it work, I don't think... small book publishers, not that the Black Library is a particularly small book publisher, but I don't think book publishers are going to be able to solve it easily either. But it remains a problem, absolutely.
I mean, I have had it where people would come up to me at a signing with a pile of identical editions, like 10 copies of the same book. And I'm like, well, do you like these all signed to you? And they're like, no, just sign them. Do you want me to sign it to eBay?
Dear future eBay publisher.
Dear future customer, enjoy this book.
I have signed a book to whom it may concern.
Executor says if you don't like scalpers, don't buy from them. Then only scalpers and their supporters get the limited edition. But Seagoats, it's sometimes hard to tell from random internet sellers. I mean, it is.
And further to that as well, if you are so desperate to buy a book and the only place to buy it is from a scalper, people are going to do that. So they exist because people want things, and the enforced scarcity, the completely manufactured scarcity of limited editions almost creates this problem. The fact that they are creating limited editions with a small number of copies, whether that's a small run of 1,000 or 2, or whether it's even a larger limited edition when it's several thousand up to 10,000 for larger properties, that's still an enforced scarcity, and it's ultimately the publisher's fault. But they're wanting to make money, and they're wanting to give a gift off to their special followers who really love it. You could just print more. You could.
I mean, there's a whole sort of FOMO kind of aspect to it as well. You know,
there is.
I think I just recently did the Kickstarter for the Blade Runner RPG, and which is fantastic, by the way. I've got to say, it's really, really cool. The special edition of that was basically the main book with a really nice cover. So it's not a million miles away from the regular edition. And I quite like that they didn't sort of add a billion new things to make it super, super desirable. They were a bit more reasonable in their scoping of it. And I think maybe that would be a way to kind of differentiate between the two different editions of stuff.
That's exactly what we did for the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay special editions as well, because we didn't want anyone to miss out. You wanted the collectors to get their collectible thing. It's got a new special funky cover and it looks really pretty. And it might have special textured paper, or it might have rough edges or something to try and make it, you know, unique and interesting with its nice little ribbon in it. But the actual content identical, to ensure that you didn't miss anything out. It's quite important, I think. I agree.
Secondhand Samurai says wish GE would just do pre-orders. I gave up collecting Black Library stuff as it became too much of a slog. And Rangdo says that's my favorite way of doing special editions. What's Seagoat saying? Printing a first edition or limited edition with a hardback or fancy cover, then printing a second edition with generic cover or softback makes more sense, as everyone can get a copy. Yeah, I like a pre-order. I think, like, if you have a pre-order, then you kind of know how many people want your limited edition. Like, that's a good way of doing it.
A bunch of Kickstarters do it. They print to order. You know, if you've got 1,349 backers at that level, you print 1,000. Actually, you print 1,370 because some of them are going to get damaged or lost in the post. But
quite a few.
Quite a few. Yes, probably you do 1,400 to be honest. And then if you're really honest, you destroy the ones that you don't use. Nobody does that.
Nope. Agreed completely. The whole idea of printing a first edition that's special and going on to other editions is quite a nice one. And particularly because second editions can often have small updates or corrections of errors. So the first edition almost becomes an artifact because of that, because it carries the older rule that didn't work, or it carries those typos, or Bob got called Bobley by mistake. And people will move on to the second edition and buy the other copy. So as a small publisher, you get a double benefit. You get the lovely collector's edition that's out there that everybody's got their hands on, but you're also potentially getting extra sales, which for small print is super important. For larger companies, they'll attempt to exploit it, obviously, but that's much less of a concern there.
Rangdo says like that stamp with the upside down airplane, or the man with the golden gun, because the first 500 are really expensive because they actually have a golden gun underneath the dust jacket. But then the publisher was like, it costs way too much to make this golden gun, so we're not going to do it on the rest of them. So they're worth like £2,000, and a first edition that doesn't have the golden gun is like worth £200. I saw that on TikTok last night. That's where I get all my good chat from. But Seagoat says, oh, this is true. Actually, remembering you've ordered something on pre-order is a challenge. Although when you get a call from your mum to say a book is like, I don't get stuff sent to my mum's house anymore, Seagoat.
Well, I've had that thing though where I've kickstarted something and then forgot, and then suddenly, like, I think it was the Space Race board game, which is a really lovely thing, full of really, really great stuff. And then like a year after I'd done it, I'd just completely forgotten that I'd sent this thing. And suddenly this huge box turned up at my house. I'm like, what the hell is this?
It's always a good time when you get the surprise box.
Yeah. And then I opened it up and I was like, oh, wow, the thing. And it was just like, you know, and it was great. It was like a lovely Christmas in the middle of summer sort of moment. Oh yeah, I remember I paid for this. Okay. And it was great.
Kickstartle. Oh, that's a good one. Kickstartle. Oh, that's a lovely portmanteau. Yeah, yes, I've had that several times. Big smiles every single time.
That is excellent. Okay, so here's one from Kilishandra that we didn't get to earlier. Kilishandra asks, the Horus Heresy novels are a multi-author project. Have you found that more of a help or a hindrance for creating your own entries?
Well, I mean, I've worked on other franchises where I've had to work in a kind of stream of writing with other authors. The Star Trek The Fall miniseries is a good example of that one. With the Heresy series, because there was so much backstory and so much material and so much lore early on, we all kind of went off and did our own thing. And it was only as the series kind of went on and the kind of walls started to close in that we had to be a bit more regimented, and we had to start paying more attention to what the other guys were doing. But because it was a great team of writers and a lot of fun people to work with, I never really felt like it was problematic. There were a few times where we argued sort of vociferously over stuff. You know, we always joked about the knife fights in the car park outside. You know, if somebody wanted to do a particular kind of thing, and there were occasionally moments where you felt like, you know, we don't want to have a land grab where someone goes, well, I want to do this thing and I want to do that thing, and we have to arm wrestle to see who gets it. In the end, I think everybody working on that project realized that the important thing was to serve the story, that we were all there in service of that narrative. And it doesn't reward you for being grabby hands with all the cool stuff. What rewards you is when you can create that interconnectivity, that holographic storytelling where each book connects to each other book, and the idea that you would go through and read all 50 odd of those books, and then if you stopped and went back to the beginning and you read them again, you would have a completely different experience because you would see stuff in the early fiction that had played out later on, that we'd had this really, really long view on stuff. And having that kind of team to put those stories together, sometimes it was challenging, but at the end, the experience was just elevating to be part of that project.
Out of curiosity, was there a stronger editing line on that in general because they were attempting to ensure that there was things seeded or there was a lack of continuity errors, or was the editing line largely the same as your other, say, 40K work or other jobs?
I think early on, it was the early days. Marc had a very strong whip hand, but that kind of eased off after he left, and, you know, other editorial people came on that.
We appear to be having some connection issues, or is it just me?
Having connection issues. No, it's me too.
It became a little bit easier.
So we know that entire answer dropped out on your side. You've your connection has dropped badly there, James. Can you say anything or hear anything?
Sure.
Oh, well, we've got a slight pause there while we try to deal with the technical issues that have arisen over at James' end.
Yeah. Seagoat says suitable skills for a novelist, according to James Swallow: knife fighting, arm wrestling, and vociferous arguing. What I'll do is I'll remove James, and then do I want to remove him and re-add him? I think I'll do that and see if that fixes
it. So I'll do a little song and dance here in the background.
There we go. We're back again.
You're back.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Oh, I'm frozen again.
Well, never mind. These things happen. We do like to be at the cutting edge of modern television. Now, there we go. You appear to be working again, James.
A slight drop out there. Excellent. Someone else in the house is watching Netflix.
Yeah.
It's like that moment when you dialed up the bulletin board and your mum picked up the phone.
That dates you.
It really does to you.
Happy days, yeah.
All of us.
Acoustic modems. Oh yeah, that takes me back.
Yes, I had to do that on an audiobook. I'd written a thing in. There's a bit in Everybody Wins where I talked about the internet going bing bong, and then I had to record the audiobook and actually make that noise.
We talked right at the start about your getting into RPGs, and then, of course, the phone call from Paramount when you're in the middle of Friday night gaming. So Seagoat has asked, are you an RPG fan? I think we know the answer. But if so, do you prefer to tell stories or roll dice/engage game mechanics, or are you too busy writing to engage in such frivolity? And that night, were you GMing or were you playing?
I was DMing. I was running... I ran a very long campaign of the original black box Cyberpunk, Talsorian Cyberpunk. That campaign lasted for like 10 years, I think. We went through like 2 or 3 editions. You know, happy days. Any of the guys out there who probably some of my friends from the old days might be watching this. So as a shout out to all the guys, the Friday Night Firefighters. Love you, boys. Yeah, so definitely been an RPG and a gaming fan from very early on. In terms of how I like to play the games, it's a bit of a mix because I love the telling stories aspect. Obviously, I'm a storyteller by trade, right? So I like the ability to do that, and I've always enjoyed as a GM that kind of sense where you have to be kind of just one step ahead of the players. You have to just dance slightly faster than they do to keep the story running, and I love the energy that comes up from that. But at the same time, I have to say, I also like that sort of Las Vegas moment when you've got the dice in your hand and, you know, there's that critical moment where it's all going to just hinge on what that D20 comes up at. So I like both aspects of it. I wouldn't favor one over the other. In terms of like what I do now, though, yeah, it is a bit frivolous for me to do role playing because I don't have the time, because I'm spending all of that energy now that I used to use generating scenarios and story concepts into actually kind of paid work and books. So I don't have the time to kind of generate stuff for role-playing games. So I tend to play a lot more board games these days. That said, in recent years, I have really been starting to feel that I miss the cut and thrust of GMing and role-playing. And I've been constantly saying, you know, I just want to pick something up and do a different thing, try something. The Blade Runner RPG I talked about, you know, that's a really, really nice game. And I look at that and I think, man, I would love to run this because it's an IP that I really love. And the game is just so well produced. I have a friend who's a huge fan of the Alien RPG. I'd love to play that. And I also just recently kickstarted the Everyday Heroes role-playing game, which is very much a sort of a harking back to kind of D20 modern. And it's very much it's like if you wanted to do Die Hard or Commando or you know, any one of those kind of movies as a role-playing game, and I love those kind of big high-octane 80s action films, it would work really, really well for that. So maybe I'll pick one of those up. I'll try and take a little bit of time out of my calendar, box a little space off, and do some role-playing stuff. I think it would be fun to kind of revisit that.
I recommend it.
So, yeah, totally recommend it. A Cyberpunk 10, like years-long campaign, we've had a few, are really hard to explain to people who don't roleplay the impact that has on your life and your friends and the way the shared headspace that you create. I've always found that the most difficult thing to explain to people, you know, in my normal life. Like, what do you do? Oh, roleplay. Yeah, it's like, you know, D&D. Not that I play D&D, but everyone knows that. And they come up with a vision that is really not the shared headspace that you get into in one of those long campaigns. We should have a song about that.
It's just, you know, when you have conversations with people and obscure stuff that just means nothing to anybody else in the room, where you mention a thing. I'll give you an example of something that happened to me very recently. Is I had a character in my Cyberpunk campaign who was the weapons seller that you would always find, and no matter where you went, he was always the guy who would sell you your gun.
Got some good trades for you, stranger.
There you go. You know, if you have coin, he has wares, right? And I always, and it became a running joke that I would have this guy turn up no matter where my players were. And the gimmick of it was that he wasn't one guy. He was actually a family of octuplets, identical octuplets. The players never figured that out. You know, they were like, can he teleport? Is he a clone? And it's just like, no, he's just a family of brothers, identical brothers. And the guy's name was Mr. Ling, because they met him very first in Hong Kong. So he's this Chinese guy. And completely out of the blue, a few months back, a friend of mine sent me a picture, and oh my God, it's real. And it was a picture of a shop, Ling's Hardware, that he just passed by. He stopped his car, he got out to take a photograph to send it to me. And he posted it on Twitter, and I was like, that's amazing. And loads of people were saying, what does that mean? And it just you just had to be there, really.
You just had to be there. Yeah, exactly.
Also, you said something that I thought, I've got two things to say. You said something I find super fascinating, and that's that almost all the authors that we've had on, and in general that I've spoken to that roleplay, almost all of them preferred or mostly GM'd. And I find that a very interesting insight into the mindset of storytellers who are attempting to do one story or another. And that's it. I'll just stop there because
I was thinking the same thing. I was going to mention it. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our hour. So thank you so much, James, for joining us. It was really lovely to meet you and have you on the show and hear all your stories over what is a very long and prestigious career.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you. Next week, we're speaking to Nathan Dowdall. We're going to be talking about mechanics, tell stories, how game rules expand the narrative. So please do join us for that. But until then, thank you to all our Patreons. Thanks to our community, a lively community on Discord. Thanks to everyone in the chat for joining us and adding your comments and questions. As always, you are what make this amazing and fun to do. And we will see you soon. All that remains to say is thank you to everyone who joined us, and good night and caw-caw.
Caw-caw. Bye-bye.